Leslie Tucker Jenison. I'm a contemporary quilt maker, fabric designer, and workshop facilitator. I really love to work with my rotary cutter without the assistance of a ruler. So when I'm working with my rotary cutter, I like to think of it as though it was a pencil or a paintbrush. And when I'm cutting fabric, I'm cutting lines as though I'm drawing, and then my pieced seams become those lines in my composition. Now I know for a lot of people who know about improvisational piecing, it causes a lot of anxiety. And I thought what I'd like to do today is talk to you about a few things you can do when you get started that make it a little less scary, and hopefully it'll be something you'll want to try on your own. One of the things that I think is important about this is to start with a shape that's easy to manage. And what I recommend is working with shapes that are between the size of your hand and maybe the tip of your finger to your elbow. If you limit yourself to that size, it'll be easier for you to learn how to piece, and then you can expand those shapes or contract them to smaller ones. But I recommend that. I just think it's more comfortable to manipulate the fabric when you're manipulating in that size parameter. The other thing I think it's probably a good idea to do is to work with solids at the beginning, just so you can see, you can see the lines a little more readily. And I think it's important to choose solids that are in at least 2 different value ranges. And if you're not in the habit of this, if you have a mobile device that has a camera, sometimes the thing that's really nice to do is set it on a tonal setting, and you can look at your values that way. It's really easy to tell them apart. I think it's good to have a light and medium or a light to dark value. You'll get some nice shapes that way, and you'll be able to see your lines a lot more easily. So when you start, and this is a little bit unusual, people are used to using a rotary cutter pushing away from themselves. But when you're doing ruler-free drawing with the ruler or with your rotary cutter, I think it's easier to pull it toward yourself. I think you have a little more control that way. So try it and see what you think. I think you'll find that you have a little more control. So I'm going to limit myself to the idea of doing a curve, a gentle curve, and then a semi-wavy line. The reason I love these kind of marks is they feel very gestural to me, and it makes me feel like you really are seeing the hand of the artist when you look at these seams and these stitches. So when I'm doing a curve, I am going to just gently pull the rotary cutter toward myself. And you'll notice that I have already cut this piece in advance, and I've got a little more allowance for this piece than I do this one. And it's because sometimes I lose a little of the size when I'm piecing the curve. So once I've cut that shape, I simply turn the piece that has the concave shape, the concave cut, over onto the convex cut, or the one that's more rounded outward. When I do it, I want to very carefully turn it so that I know that I'm keeping the same mark that I cut. I'll take that to the machine, and on this one, I'm going to just go without pinning it. Place it underneath the feed dogs, and I've got a 1/4 inch presser foot on here. So I will position this in such a way that I'm kind of controlling both pieces of the fabric separately. So I'm just going to go along the edge of this, and once I get to the part where the curve starts, I will, slow the stitching down just a little bit and just gently ease that concave shape around the convex one. I find it's easier to work this way. I think it's just easier to do the convex on top. I think it wants to stretch, and it's a little more malleable than the other shape. I always have a 1/4 inch seam, and don't scrimp on this, because when you go to press these, since you're working with organic shapes, you want to be able to press them so that they're flat. Okay, so once you have your curve and you've sewn this seam, you can sort of sit and check it to see if you've managed to get it smooth, and then the next thing I do is take it over to the ironing board and press it really flat. So I will start with the seam side facing me, and it's really good if you have some kind of a stabilizer before you press it. I always press this so that the seam is going out. It's pressing away from the convex shape. I think that it tends to lay flatter that way, so I really give it a good press on the stitch side up, and then I turn it over and just check. Sometimes when I press, there might be a little bit of a fold, so I'm going to make sure that I've gotten that all out. And then I've got a nice flat shape. So the next thing I'm going to do is show you how I do a line. And the one thing about doing a line or even a slightly curved line is you have to make sure you have plenty of overlap between your two pieces. The main thing is that when you're cutting, yes, I know that I could approximate these. They're pretty close to being straight lines, but if I do that enough times without actually cutting a new line, I'm going to end up with some buckling. So what I do, again, I'm pulling this toward myself, and I'll give myself just a slight curve. I'm going to remove the excess pieces. Make sure I know I've got these approximated the way that I cut them. I'm going to fold this over. Again, I like to have the concave shape on top, taking it back to the machine and sewing it again. If you have a machine that has the ability to allow the presser foot to lift up while you're stitching and going around curves, it's a really great tool. But again, I'm doing a 1/4 inch seam here. I'm holding each of these pieces separately and manipulating them with my hands so that I can readjust them as I need to as we go around the edge of this very gradual curve, which is sort of like an organic straight line in my mind. Okay, and then I can cut it. And again, take it right over to the ironing board. Seam side up. I'm going to use a little bit of a press stabilizer. And again, I'm pressing it away from the convex shape. I really press it and then turn it, check it, and do the same thing on the top. And I can keep working this way with all these different units. Once I get enough of them pieced, then I can start assembling them together, and that's what I've done here. Often what I'll do is I'll create a road map for myself by just using a very rough sketch, and this I may or may not adhere to. It's just some place to start. It gives me an idea, but you can see that I can vary the width of my rows, and I'll usually piece these side by side and then join the rows together. So in this case, I've got 2 pieces of fabric that I have assembled some of my individual units that I've pieced, and then you have to make decisions about which one of these edges you want to be the priority. If I decide this is the one that I want on top, then I'm gonna have that edge on the top so that I can see it. But if you've got something you don't want to cut into, then you want to put that on the top layer so that you can make sure you don't cut through something you want to keep. So if I want to cut this, again, I want an overlap, or at least to make sure that the 2 seams are approximated, and then I can pull my rotary cutter toward me. It's a habit that you develop and you get used to. Remove the excess pieces, and I know that I've got a little bit of a difference here, but I can take care of that after I've made this stitch. So again, folding those over, taking them to the machine, and sewing. So I encourage you to stay in this size range until you get a little more comfortable. If you have a seam such as this one, I'm going to pull this quilt over so you can see it. This particular curve is a little bit sharper, and so on a curve like that, I would probably choose to cut these 2 shapes again with the concave on top, and I would pin them carefully so that I could be sure I continue to have this approximated shape. But here's another example of those same 2 shapes made into a quilt. And then, as I said before, you can expand or contract the size of the pieces that you're making. Here's a smaller one that I stitched together. And here's a much larger one, all using the same techniques of over approximating, cutting through, and piecing. And here's yet another example of how you can do it with curves, lines, and various different shapes you can continue to add in. So I hope you've gotten a little bit of an idea of how you can do improv piecing, and I hope you'll give it a chance and try to cut your own shapes with a rotary cutter without using a ruler.